Hi there, and welcome to Period 7 of the AP US History Study Guide. This portion of the guide will take us through a window of time in American history where just a few things happened. You know, the years between 1890 and 1945. This time was marked by an increasingly pluralistic United States that faced profound domestic and global challenges, debated the proper degree of government activism, and sought to define its international role. Let's start with our first key concept for Period 7. We can probably all agree that the US was a nation vastly different than the one created in 1789. Governmental, political, and social organizations struggled to address new kinds of economic uncertainty, growing divides between different social strata, and the massive issues that came along with urbanization and mass migration. Let's label our first theme as New Century, New America. Beginning in the 1890s, the United States embarked on a new, far-reaching foreign policy that included sprinklings of imperialism and a whole lot of intrusion into the politics of foreign nations. It is at this point that the United States proposes to take over several island nations, literally cuts a continent in half in the name of commercial efficiency and economic opportunity, and works to leverage international currency to exert power over economically weak nations. The Cuban struggle in the 1890s for independence from a weakened Spanish Empire attracted attention in the United States. William Randolph Hearst, publisher of the New York Journal, seized on the Cuban cause, which he supported, as an opportunity to boost newspaper circulation. Hearst sent reporters and illustrators to Cuba to report on atrocities and was rumored to have said, "You furnish the pictures and I will furnish the war." On February 15, 1898, an explosion sank the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor, killing 266 sailors. Hearst's New York Journal printed editorials placing the blame for the so-called accident on Spain. The declaration of war against Spain 2 months later and the landing of American troops in Cuba marked the decision by the US government to expand the scope of US foreign policy. The declaration of war against Spain in 1898 prompted the U.S. to order military action in the Philippines, a Spanish colony in the Pacific. The U.S. occupation of the island led to bloody conflicts between U.S. troops and Filipinos who had been fighting for independence from Spain. A provision of the 1898 treaty ending the Spanish-American War ceded the Philippines to the U.S. The ratification of the treaty set off debates in Congress over whether the U.S. should acquire overseas territories. The Roosevelt administration confronted the question of how to cement a U.S. foothold in Latin America and create a more efficient route for trade of goods between the two sides of the world. The Panama Canal was part of the answer to this question. Begun by France in the 1880s, the canal was stalled by a series of diplomatic issues. Panama took the land back until it declared its independence in 1903. Promptly, the U.S. used the Navy to blockade the area around the canal until it was granted building and administrative rights over what became known as the Panama Canal Zone. Teddy Roosevelt devised a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine as part of his State of the Union address in 1904. Reminding the people of the United States' role as an international police power, the president committed the nation to using its power to end unjust European incursion into Latin American states and nations. Between 1906 and 1924, the Roosevelt corollary was cited as justification for moves into Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. We can refer to this henceforth as big stick politics. The next president, William Howard Taft, applied the big stick policy to international economic relationships. As we talk about something called dollar diplomacy, it is important to see this simply as the Taft administration's efforts to create economic leverage with which the U.S. would then use to exert political and social control over the governments it lent to. In this effort to secure financial investments in Latin America, private corporations and the U.S. government spent time and money creating pathways for the entry of private capital into foreign markets. At the end, this kind of diplomacy mostly failed in its attempt to provide stability to the people and governments of the developing nations, resulting in various political revolutions. Remember to check out the following documents and essays in the Gilder-Lehrman collection. We have Remember the Maine from 1898, Our Victorious Fleet in Cuban Waters, Empire Building, and the United States in the Caribbean. While the U.S. dove into international politics, it is important to also discuss the significant domestic changes in the United States from 1900 to 1914. Crucial to the changes in this era was the work of the crusading journalists called muckrakers and reformers whose exposure of scandals, political and economic corruption, unsafe working conditions, and urban poverty sparked the progressive era. At the turn of the century, employment conditions were largely unregulated. There were dangerous conditions in factories, mines, and tenement sweatshops. Women and children worked without hour restrictions, health codes, or access to education. Workers united and began to demand more rights from their bosses, and, with progressive reformers, for some iteration of government regulation of the economy. Among the most influential muckraking works on this subject was Ida Tarbell's 1904 The History of Standard Oil, which exposed questionable and monopolistic business practices. These exposés helped secure the passage in 1914 of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which was built on the 1890s Sherman antitrust legislation. The new act included specific provisions for unions' right to organize within major industries, limitations on corporate leadership, meaning one person can't be on the board of two competing organizations. Pre-merger notification became a requirement under this new law. Other muckraking-inspired reform efforts included the inflammatory exposure of the Chicago meatpacking industry in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle prompted an extraordinarily important piece of public health legislation with the Clean Food and Drug Act of 1906. Women like Jane Addams and Margaret Sanger professionalized social work through the settlement movement, education reform, and a crusade for women's health care. Ultimately, however, women would only win their long struggle for the vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Underlying many of these urban reform efforts was the ongoing public unease about immigration, which resulted in tightening restrictions in the 1924 Immigration Act. The act greatly limited immigration numbers and rolled national quotas back to numbers based on the 1890 census. That meant greater numbers of Western Europeans like the English, Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians, and far fewer Eastern and Southern Europeans and Jewish immigrants. Asians were essentially barred altogether. In the first decades of the 20th century, African Americans left the southern states, where they had been subject to impoverished economic situations and relentless persecution by the Ku Klux Klan. This mass movement, or Great Migration, led to the settlement of African Americans in northern industrial cities such as Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York. During the early years of the century, key new civil rights organizations were born, including the Niagara Movement, the NAACP, and Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement. But those years also witnessed violent race riots in Chicago in 1919 and Tulsa in 1921. Remember to pay close attention to the Gilder Lehrman AP Study Guide to find essential documents relating to these concepts and to gather a more specific understanding of this chronology of important events. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire in 1911. Disenfranchisement of African American voters in Virginia from 1901, Women's Suffrage Poster from 1915, and Birth of a Nation, which is a screenplay from 1915. This moves us to our next key concept. A revolution in communications and transportation technology helped create a new mass culture and spread modern values and ideas, even as cultural conflicts between groups increased under the pressure of migration, world wars, and economic distress. Woodrow Wilson, who was elected president in 1913, supported moral balance as the basis for his foreign policy. If the moral compass didn't line up, the United States could, and would, use its alliances and economic power against nations. Wilson subsequently used this program of moral diplomacy to push his agenda in Haiti, Nicaragua, and Panama. As Europe went to war in 1914, Wilson and the U.S. Congress were posed with a bunch of billion-dollar questions. What role does the United States take in this emerging global conflict? Does the nation go way back to the ideals of Washington in his farewell address? Why not stay completely neutral and keep totally out of the war? In 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania by German U-boats inflamed American passions. Then, in 1917, a telegram from Germany's Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico promising the return of now U.S. lands in exchange for a possible alliance became public. The outcry over the Zimmermann affair and the Germans' resumption of submarine warfare helped make the case for the U.S. entering the war. Wilson really believed that this would be a war to end all wars, and saw the American military as an agent in this goal. In 1918, Wilson gave several addresses that comprise what we know now as his 14 points. The ideal behind these points pointed to the creation of a new balance of power in Europe, and further, a just and secure peace in the aftermath of conflict. We come to the third chapter of U.S. involvement in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies drove home a treaty that would cripple their former opponents' ability to wage any future conflict against them. Here's a quick side note. The U.S. Congress would not ratify the U.S. participation in the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson was not able to gain enough support for the U.S. to sign on with the subsequent establishment of the League of Nations. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, a general fear swept through the U.S. government and society. That concern led to the Espionage Act of 1917, which made illegal any kind of interference with military efforts during a time of war, including the creation, possession, or distribution of anti-American propaganda. Congress then extended the Espionage Act's reach with the Sedition Act in 1920, which forbade disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States. A rash of xenophobia ran throughout the nation, manifesting in a Red Scare headlined by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and up-and-coming FBI agent J. Edgar Hoover. The press was quick to pick up on it, and headlines only fanned this flame of fear in all corners of the country. As an important last note, labor unions were also severely impacted by the Sedition Acts. 169 officers of the IWW were arrested under the provisions of this act. Let's take a short pause from the story and remind ourselves about some documents that will come in handy when thinking about your discussion of World War I. These include World War I poems, In Flanders Fields and the Answer, from 1918, recruiting posters for African American soldiers, also from 1918, Treaty of Versailles and President Wilson, and Food Will Win the War, which is an image. As we roll into the 1920s, there's quite a bit to think about. American culture moves towards increased patterns of consumerism and consumption. People were borrowing money at record highs and business was booming. Cities had been growing, and during the 1920s, more Americans began living in cities than on farms. Temperance meets the Constitution with the enactment of the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. The Volstead Act resulted in the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution as a call for temperance and moderation in America. After World War I, many African American veterans joined the Great Migration and resettled in the North. A cultural, artistic, and literary renaissance was booming in Harlem. Think about the amazing contributions made by Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston. For the first time, we see a surge of pride in African American communities. For more on what we've covered to this point, see the following documents and essays on the Gilder Lehrman website. The Supreme Court upholds national prohibition from 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti from 1921, Lynching in America from 1926, and F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Age of Excess, and Prohibition and its Effects. When you think about a next step, you could say what goes up must come down. The roar of the 1920s was also defined by massive political corruption, wild margin buying by people in every corner of American life, the ascendancy of a new ultra-rich class of Americans, and a market moving towards its ultimate tipping point. On Black Tuesday, the nation's booming economy literally just stopped. Herbert Hoover's administration responded slowly. Hoover had no plans to involve the federal government in direct economic intervention programs, and as a result, the economy slid into a full-scale depression. Hoover's name became synonymous with failure and hard times. Then the nation was hit with the full-blown effects of the Midwestern Dust Bowl. With the nation teetering on the edge of collapse and nearly 25% of Americans unemployed in 1932, something new had to come along to help the situation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected and immediately began pushing what became known as the New Deal. FDR's New Deal included massive federal intervention in the economic recovery following the crash of financial markets, new regulatory efforts that would limit Americans' vision of a future of unlimited economic splendor, spending, and spending more, and a series of political moves, popular and unpopular alike, that would change the face of America as it moved beyond this particular crisis. During FDR's first 100 days, a variety of legislative acts were presented and passed through Congress. Some heavy hitters to remember are these. The Tennessee Valley Authority Act was passed to allow for government-sponsored building of dams and the creation of a cheap hydroelectric power source for that region of the country. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid commodity farmers to leave their fields fallow in order to decrease surplus and stabilize agricultural pricing. The National Industrial Recovery Act allowed workers to unionize and made provisions for collective bargaining rights. The Wagner Act, or otherwise known as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, created the platform for the protection of laborers across the country and prohibited what were deemed unfair labor practices. We also have to touch on the creation of what we'll call New Deal government agencies. These are often referred to as the alphabet agencies, created to A. put Americans back to work, B. provide structures for government-sponsored relief with employment and welfare and others, and C. cultivate a new social and political norm of government intervention in the national economy. Just to name a few, try to remember the WPA, the FDIC, the CCC, the FCC, the FAA, the USHA, the SEC, and the SSA. FDR needed to ensure that his New Deal programs would fly through a Congress and a Supreme Court that may not have been totally on the same page as the president. Enter FDR's court-packing proposal. On March 9, 1937, FDR, in one of his very famous fireside chats, clearly accused the Supreme Court of stalling necessary legislation and governmental momentum. FDR proposed to recreate the Supreme Court with up to 15 justices and an age limit, and the Senate kiboshed the whole thing with a whopping 70-22 vote. Make sure, when looking into the Great Depression, that you refer to the following documents on the AP U.S. History Study Guide. We have Herbert Hoover's inaugural address from 1929, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inauguration in 1933, the origins of FDR's New Deal in 1932, a photograph of a Hooverville from 1936, and Re-elect Roosevelt, Friend of Labor, which is an illustrated document. Next, we come to our final key concept for Period 7 of the AP US History exam. Let's call this one the Emerging Global Superpower. While the US was in the latter stages of recovery from the Great Depression, Adolf Hitler marched German forces across several European borders and to the brink of another global conflict. At first, European leaders appeased Germany. When appeasement failed, Europe descended into World War II. In its efforts to stitch up the financial wounds of the 1930s, the US stayed out of the fray and let its European partners take the lead. The US did so by passing the Neutrality Act of 1939. It's as if they were saying to the world, you seem to be fighting in the sandbox and we're not going to pick sides. Right now. In 1941, they tested the limits of neutrality by enacting the Lend-Lease Act. As a neutral nation, the US would stay out of direct action, but would sell, transfer, or lease equipment and arms to nations whose defense the President deems vital to the defense of the United States. So how does the United States eventually get jumped into World War II? On December 7, 1941, Japan executed the massive attack on the U.S. naval installation at Pearl Harbor. On that morning, more than 2,500 American service people lost their lives, 30 ships were lost, and more than 300 planes were destroyed. On what FDR called a day that will live in infamy, the U.S. plunged into the melee of World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. participated in the war on all fronts, from the forests and cities of Europe to the islands of the South Pacific and Japan. Though the fighting of the war was clearly outside the United States, its tentacles certainly reached into the lives of every American. From the factory workers building planes and ships, to the families awaiting the safe return of husbands and sons, and school kids supporting the effort through Victory Gardens. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a pointed resentment of all things Japanese. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066 that allowed the Secretary of War to separate and intern Japanese and Japanese Americans as a protective measure during World War II. With this order came the removal of Japanese from mainstream society and often the seizure of their property and land. Dozens of camps were established to maintain this separation, where Japanese Americans of all ages were interned from 1942 through 1946. So as the war is winding towards its conclusion, we have the start of talks that would both end the war and set the stage for another 50 years of issues for the US and the world to deal with. When they met at Yalta, the leaders of the world's emerging superpowers, FDR, Stalin, and Churchill, met to discuss the unconditional surrender of Germany, some swapping of land, and how they would collaborate to finish the war in the Pacific against remaining Japanese forces. Upon Roosevelt's death later that year, Harry Truman was sworn in and worked with Stalin and Churchill at Potsdam, where they decided what to do with regards to the administration of Germany following its surrender. As the war in the Pacific allowed the Allied forces to move towards an invasion of Japan, Truman debated whether or not to exercise the power of nuclear weaponry. Truman's ordering of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered the world into a new era where the potential for widespread destruction was now a possibility. Following the invasion of Japan and the bombing of those two cities, Japanese forces surrendered in 1945 to mark the close of World War II. Wow, with all of that, it is essential that you check out the following documents on the AP US History Study Guide on the Gilder-Lehrman website. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Good Neighbor Policy from 1936, Japan Declares War, A Soldier's Reasoning for Enlisting in 1942, Japanese Internment Instructions from 1942, and Eleanor Roosevelt's Four Basic Rights from 1944. As you move through the periods, remember the themes, thinking carefully about how to organize the information you come across, and continue to reference the study guide materials and the massive document collection on the AP US History Study Guide and on the Gilder-Lehrman website. Hi there, I'm here with Tim Bailey, Education Director at the Gilder-Lehrman Institute of American History, to discuss the third of 4 historical thinking skills that will be required of you at various points throughout the AP US History exam. Hey, Tim.
Hey, David. How you doing?
Good. How are you today?
I'm good. I was just actually taking a look here at Skill 3 that the College Board has put out, sort of defining these historical thinking skills that they're looking for. And Skill 3 here says, crafting historical arguments from historical evidence. So I was wondering if you could help me out, because the first component is historical argumentation. And what it says here is, Historical thinking involves the ability to define and frame a question about the past and to address that question by constructing an argument. A plausible and persuasive argument requires a clear, comprehensive, and analytical thesis supported by relevant historical evidence, not simply evidence that supports a preferred or preconceived position. Additionally, argumentation involves the capacity to describe, analyze, and evaluate the arguments of others in light of available evidence.
Really, this just means that you have to develop and flesh out an evidence-based thesis that will provide a clear, comprehensive discussion of a historical issue, while recognizing and rebutting opposing viewpoints. Here's a possible thesis. The New Deal saved the U.S. economy. You'll have to explain the different aspects of the New Deal that best supports the claim that its programs had significant positive impact on the U.S. economy. You'll then present a counterclaim. Let's say that your counterclaim is that the New Deal was not the savior of the U.S. economy, but in fact, it was an attempt on the part of the U.S. government to try its hand at large-scale social engineering. Then, with expanded or new evidence, you'll have to refute that counterclaim and make concrete conclusions that support your original thesis.
It goes on to say you want to have appropriate use of relevant historical evidence. And the way they explain that is, historical thinking also involves the ability to identify, describe, and evaluate evidence from the past from diverse sources, written documents, works of art, archaeological artifacts, oral traditions, and other primary sources with respect to content, authorship, purpose, format, and audience. And it says here, historical thinking involves the ability to understand such evidence in its context, recognize its limitations, and assess the points of view that it reflects.
So when I think about this particular skill, it just reminds me that evidence is everywhere. Whatever you can find that is appropriate in the effort to write this argument is acceptable. You can use examples of art, architecture, music, almost anything. Let's just use a photograph for an example. Nearly any photograph can be used, but it is the historical context of that photo that makes the difference for your efforts with the AP. Just remember, you must put the evidence in the context of your discussion. This context will show that you have an understanding of how different pieces of evidence will act as supports for different parts of your argument.